Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the world watches as Trump's tariffs head to the Supreme Court.
I think it's the most important decision, one of the most important decisions in the history of our country.
What could this mean for the U.S.'s current trade talks with India? And how much damage has already been done to workers? I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment telling us what you think about this episode and what stories you want to see us do next. On your podcast app, leave us a review telling us where you're listening from. And give us a 5-star review while you're there. It helps the show.
My name is Jayati Ghosh. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the US. And I'm speaking to you today from Northampton in Massachusetts.
Well, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. We're speaking with you on Friday, and India is in the middle of trade talks with the U.S., and it's still facing a 50% tariff on its exports that were imposed by President Donald Trump. These are some of the highest in the world. Now, his America First trade policy to supposedly bring back jobs to the U.S. has meant constant swings and tariffs and tensions with U.S. trading partners since in the months that he's been in office. It's been a real roller coaster ride. From the start, you have been warning that these tariffs could really hurt countries like India. Jayati, what were your main concerns?
Well, my main concern was, in fact, not necessarily the high tariffs so much as the uncertainties that are created by this. And of course, those have really just been exacerbated in the last 6 months, because the one thing we know is that nothing is certain. And so he can declare 150% tariffs against a certain country and then the next day pause them for 9 months and then 5 weeks later say, I don't like something you did, so I'm imposing 75%. It goes on and on.
Right.
Now, what that does is that it means that countries that are basing a lot of their manufacturing employment on exports, not just to the US, but as part of value chains that then export to the US, they face real uncertainty because they simply don't know. And that obviously slows down investment, it slows down orders, it slows down production and employment, and therefore manufacturing activity.
So what you're talking about is, this uncertainty has really created a kind of chaos. But before we even get into how this is being felt around the world for people who are listening in the U.S. who might feel like this is, distant trade politics, how have these tariffs already been showing up in the everyday life in the U.S.?
Well, it's just started to show in the US. And I think that's very important for most people in the US to realize that they heard all the announcements and then they thought, oh my God, tomorrow prices will go up. But they didn't. And so they said, well, okay, so it's no big deal. What's happened over the last few months since April is that, first of all, there's been a bunching of imports before the tariffs came into place. So all the companies and multinationals and distributors made sure they had enough stocks for the next few months. Then there's been a pausing of those tariffs. And then there have been all kinds of random deals. And I have to say random because it's kind of arbitrary with certain countries. And there have been exemptions as well. So consumers in the US have not really felt the impact of the tariffs yet.
Not yet, right.
They will. They are starting to feel it now because some of those tariffs are finally being imposed. And more than that, the uncertainty that I mentioned. And one specific thing, the the zero tariff entry of very small items that was earlier permitted has been stopped.
And the Trump administration caught many off guard when it canceled an exemption and started collecting duties on shipments under $800.
So that impacts a lot of the e-commerce-based consumption of garments, of toys, of individual small items that have become the norm for many households to just order online.
I imagine Americans may start feeling these tariffs as soon as they start doing their Christmas shopping, or maybe by Black Friday.
Well, I think it's going to happen even before that, because a lot of things that you don't really think about very much. I had a faucet fixed recently. The plumber came and told me that I'm lucky that it's the last faucet he was able to lay his hands on.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Where are faucets being imported from?
Well, guess where? China, of course.
From China, yeah.
But it's not just that. Certainly the garments, all of those fast fashion kinds of brands that used to sell individual garments online, many of those have actually just stopped sending to the US because it's so complicated now and there's so much bureaucratic paperwork that the margins don't exist, actually. So I think it goes into all kinds of things, home repair, upholstery, various kinds of things that US consumers are very now used to just getting at a moment's notice at very low prices.
Meanwhile, in countries that have been facing these tariffs, it's really already started to affect them greatly. We've seen Brazil hit with a 50% tariff, Laos and Myanmar at 40%. That's just to name a few. Now, I really want to zoom in on India because that's where Trump's focus seems to be right now.
Well, we stand great, and the people of India, I love the people of India, and we're working on some great deals between our countries.
It's also where a massive amount of American goods are imported from, from clothing to jewelry to sneakers. The U.S. is India's largest export market, right? But this wasn't always the case. Jayati, maybe you could walk us through a history of how India's economy became so tied to the U.S.?
We became much more reliant on the US market, as did many other countries, in the period when the US consumer market was growing very rapidly. First in the 1990s, then in the 2000s especially. And it's remained at between 18 to 20%. At the moment, it's slightly less than 18% of the Indian exports of goods. But in services, it's huge. And this is strongly related to the period of economic liberalization in India that we saw from 1991 onwards, where basically goods trade was significantly liberalized, as were the rules for foreign direct investment and for foreign portfolio investment, which is to say, capital flows of different kinds. This period gave a boom to the Indian economy. India was seen as this attractive destination. Lots of that money came flowing in. That generated a kind of boom in all of, in the stock market, which then also led to secondary expansion of especially the elites and the upper middle classes in India.
And this period that you're talking about, this is when we start to see more Indian workers are starting to produce for exports, for U.S. exports. Companies like The Gap, Zara, what impact did that have on their lives?
Oh, so for sure, what we saw in the period, especially from, let's say, the early 2000s onwards, is that there was more and more of the garment industry being oriented towards these global value chains. So Zara, Nike, Benetton, Gap, all of these big chains did get involved in some parts of the production being located in India. And that did lead to an expansion of workers, especially women workers. In the garment industry, in textiles and garments, it's dominantly women at the lower end of the wage employment. In the automobile sector, which was the other big expanding sector, it was mostly men workers. But you find clusters of these export-oriented manufacturing units in different parts of the country where you have migrant workers coming in. You have more and more of the local urban working class finding employment, because wage employment has been a big concern in India. We've not been able to generate proper, regular wage employment as we should.
And I'm curious, how did that shift change workers' lives in India?
Well, certainly where there are more women who get these jobs, it improves the overall household conditions. Typically, we find that when women get wages, they're also more concerned about ensuring, proper food, education, and health conditions for their children. We've seen associated over this period, we've seen significant increases in girls' school enrollment. It's not the only reason, but, there are various other things that were happening along this time. And women being employed often contributes to that.
We'll have more after the break.
A young woman killed a stranger in South Korea because of her obsession with true crime stories. Her curiosity for dark tales became a deadly impulse to try out one of her own. Is the media responsible? Does true crime harm more than it helps? Hear the full story on True Crime Reports.
Since the tariffs were introduced, exports from India to the U.S. have fallen by 37.5%, and it's already having a dramatic impact. When Trump first announced his tariffs, independent journalist Yash Raj Sharma went out to talk to workers to find out how tariffs were affecting their lives.
When I met these workers, when I met these business owners, that's when you realize that there are a lot of thousands of workers, hundreds and thousands of workers on the other end of this entire trade war who are facing the brunt of it. This is what they talk about. This is what they, read up in the news. This is what they look ahead to. And this has become the conversation within the circle, within the cities that are so export heavy that, the entire sort of environment and the mood around that, those industries and those cities have changed, because with those workers, we see that hundreds and thousands of families are completely dependent on some of these industries like textile or the shrimp export industry. Some of those facilities were talking about 90% layoff that they had planned. I could see that paranoia and sort of anxiety building up. And now, after so many months, now we have the data that shows us what happened. A recent report from a trade think tank based in Delhi came earlier this week that tells us that the most labor-intensive markets, like the textile industries or even the gem and jewelry ones, that exports fell by a record 33%. The managers were telling me that it is heartbreaking for them as well to lay off so many hundreds of workers.
If it continues for another next month also, we cannot give work to the employees because it is very difficult. Already we are balancing with the rest of the orders.
Yash Raj visited Dollar City, which is very reliant on the textile industry. He spoke to one of the managers of an international firm there.
And he was trying to explain me that how this entire textile industry for them works year in advance. That everything that they are sort of preparing, everything that they are sort of exporting right now is aimed for the next fall or the next year's summer. And once you're out of the game for a year, the global fashion or the global textile industry is not going to stop for them. They are going to continue sourcing from traders or from people, from traders from other countries that are not facing as high tariff as India. And the recent research reports do tell us that that is happening in part. Indian textile market is already losing out to Vietnam, Mexico, and some to China.
U.S. customers are still with us now, but they won't stay for long. This is because there's around a 30% difference in tariffs between us and other countries. So due to this, they could start placing orders with other countries.
Many of the garment industries, the small factories who are outsourced to, by the big companies, say that they're just not getting orders for the last 6 months. They haven't got new orders, like zero. So clearly there is already a massive impact. We haven't seen it play out in the data yet because, data collection, it'll come after a year or 2 years. But it's very clearly the case that in a lot of these sectors, employment is declining rapidly and could even be collapsing altogether.
If that were to happen, where, these orders that, like you say, this is already occurring, what do you expect to see in the ordinary lives of people in India who work for these companies or who are producing?
You see, already, because the wages were not really increasing that much, already you found many workers in multiple activities. Because often a lot of it is literally daily wage casual work. You go to the factory site and find out whether you can work that day or not. But in addition, that would not be enough. So you would have to take on other work. You would be doing home-based outsourced work. You would be doing other kinds of service work, maybe domestic work in people's houses. So multiple activities. And that's going to increase. And I'm sure that's already increased because people will be scrounging around for incomes.
Trump, he took credit for ending the conflict between India and Pakistan, saying that he threatened both countries with a 250% tariff if they didn't stop.
And I called Prime Minister Modi. I said, we can't make a trade deal with you. No, we must make a trade deal. I said, no, we can't. You're starting a war with Pakistan. We're not going to do it. And then I called Pakistan. I said, we're not going to do trade with you because you're fighting with India.
So he's really, talking a big game on the power of his tariffs. Now, India hasn't confirmed any of this, but what does that tell you about how Trump sees tariffs and what his goals are in this negotiation with India?
Well, clearly he keeps saying it, that it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary, right? He thinks tariffs can solve everything. And he seems to forget that, in fact, it's the US consumer who is paying the tariffs. It's not the country's concerned. Yes, their export markets are hit, but they will look for other export markets over time. There will be an immediate cost, but then they will divert some of the trade. But he seems to think that it's tariffs, or at least he seems to announce that it's tariffs that are doing this. I would argue that there is another game going on at the same time, and he's aware of that, or certainly his team, his advisors are aware of that. In India, the pressure is being put not just in terms of high tariffs, it's being put on the cronies of the Modi government. So Mr. Gautam Adani, who is a very, very close associate of the Prime Minister of India and has extensive business interests which could be threatened, has a case against him, the Department of Justice in the US, and that's being kept as a Damocles sword to bring the Indian government to heel.
One of the world's richest people, Indian billionaire Gautam Adani, has been indicted on multiple counts of fraud in the United States. The criminal charges are related to his alleged role in a scheme to bribe officials in India. Prosecutors say he and other senior executives paid more than $250 million to win contracts for his renewable energy company.
Similarly, Mukesh Ambani, the richest man in Asia, major petrochemical and oil company, has very diversified interests. He is accused of basically re-exporting Russian oil.
Back in January, Ambani and wife Neeta were at a Trump pre-inauguration dinner in Washington. 7 months later, the same president is accusing India's tycoons of profiteering off Vladimir Putin's war, and Ambani is target number one.
So what the Trump administration is trying to do is actually to threaten the cronies. And I would argue that that is actually a weaker spot for the Modi government than the tariffs per se. Because, when you think about the real impact of the tariffs, it's really 3% of Indian GDP that is affected. And that would impact the growth rate. It would definitely, as I said, hurt some workers, for sure. But it's not a big, huge bash on the Indian economy. What will be more scary for the Modi government is this attack on the close business interests of his own cronies. And I think that is pressure that they are actively using. So my fear is that if a trade deal is signed, it will be one where the interests of those cronies will be exchanged for favors granted to US business.
And as for what India has said, as of Friday, Indian officials have responded cautiously so far to Trump's claims that a trade deal is imminent. India's trade minister in August 2025 declared that India will not bow down nor show any signs of weakness, despite the U.S. using tariffs as a pressure tactic. So, Jayati, to wrap up here, I mean, we could see a trade deal soon between India and the U.S. that brings the tariffs down. But what are the lessons that you think that can be taken from what's happened here, as countries adapt to this new reality?
Well, I think number one, there's no cause for celebration if a trade deal is signed, because we know that some really bad trade deals have been signed, bad for the other country. Okay. And so we would really have to see the fine print to decide whether it's worth it. But in any case, any country that signs a trade deal with the US must know that it will not last. I mean, he's the one who did the US, Canada, Mexico trade deal and then tore it up a few years down the line, saying, no, this is a terrible deal for the US. So there is no certainty. Number two, what does that mean? It means reduce your reliance on the US, both in trade terms and in financial terms. And I want to emphasize the financial part because it's not adequately talked about. But associated with the push for US big corporations is the push for US finance. and the demand to open up even further and deregulate even further financial sectors in other countries in very problematic and dubious activities like cryptocurrency. So lesson number 2, don't do that. Avoid anything that will increase your vulnerability to the US. Lesson number 3, I would say, is let's rethink the whole growth model that we have had over the past 2 decades, which is of export-led growth. When you think about it, there are some clear successes, right? I mean, China, obviously, Vietnam, yes. But really, you can count on the fingers of one hand the very clear success stories. Everybody else in the entire developing world has tried that game, but it hasn't delivered what it promised to. So instead of this obsession with export-led growth based on northern markets, we should be thinking of diversified exports for sure, but more domestic markets, regional markets, relying on higher wages as a source of your own domestic demand, and enabling a more sustainable pattern of growth that doesn't destroy your environment, doesn't rely on cheap workforce, but on a healthy, educated, and happier workforce with the minimum decent working conditions. Change our strategy of growth away from export-led growth to one that is based on sustainable domestic demand.
And what about for the average person in the U.S., someone who might believe that Trump, they might believe Trump when he says that this is about protecting jobs and American workers. What would you say to them about who benefits and who really pays the price here?
I think, again, for the U.S., I would say, number 1, remember, it is U.S. consumers who are paying the tariffs. It's not the rest of the world. So when your prices go up, when you face shortages, that's because of U.S. policy, which Trump claims is directed against the rest of the world. When Trump says, we're collecting so much money, trillions of dollars in tariffs, that's your money he's collecting. It is the U.S. consumers' money that is being collected as tax revenues. So that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2, jobs are not going to come back in manufacturing. Even if production comes back, it will be much more automated, mechanized, robotized. Jobs are not going to come back. So forget about the old classic pattern of the factory job, the male breadwinner coming home to the wife with 2 kids, looking after the house. All that is over. Number 3 is that as long as the other kinds of moves that Trump is making, the financial deregulation, the encouragement of crypto, the encouraging of bubbles in the stock market, and so on, these are very dangerous and are increasingly likely to lead to another financial crisis. And we have seen over and over again that in the financial crisis, the people who pay are not the ones who gained. It will be the working class of the US, again, that will pay the price.
We are certainly moving into we've already moved into some very unpredictable times. Jayati, thank you so much for coming on The Take.
You're most welcome. It was a pleasure.